March 31st is International Trans Day of Visibility. In an effort to amplify trans visibility beyond a single day, Let's Be Perfectly Queer has offered up space to allow trans voices to be heard, trans stories to be shared, and trans experiences to be learned from. And so, trans activist and advocate Jayce Carver takes over the hosting duties tonight and welcomes her guest, educator, writer, and consultant, Fae Johnstone, to the show. Let's hear what they have to say.
Hi, folks. My name is Jayce Carver. As Randy just introduced me, I'm here excited to be introducing Fae Johnstone, my guest for today on Let's Be Perfectly Queer on Rogers TV Barrie. Fae, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, I've been fangirling over you now for a while. We have mutual friends that kind of introduced us through Facebook, and you know, we kind of have worked in the same sector, doing some of the same kind of work. This last year, I really watched you kind of open up and really kind of take your place as a trans activist even more so, and launch some things that needed to happen in the trans community. And so first, can I get you to do a little introduction, a little history of Fae Johnstone, who they are, pronouns, and tell us some of the history of things that you've done and where you are today.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Fae Johnstone. I use she and they pronouns. I'm joining today from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, otherwise known as Ottawa. In terms of who I am, I love and hate this question because I'm always like, how do you capture a person in like a hot second, right? But I guess, so I am trans, I'm non-binary. I've been out for, I want to say 5 years now, but it feels like it's been like literal decades. I think trans time just like, you just become old in like a hot second because everyone's harassing you. And so you just like, you get wrinkles quickly. And that's why we all wear makeup.
True.
But,
sorry.
Right? In terms of my work, so how do I answer this? I've been doing like trans and 2S LGBTQ work for about 5 or 6 years now. I started out doing, like LGBTQ 101 workshops in high schools. And now I have the privilege, I work and live full time doing 2S LGBTQ inclusion work, advocating for 2S LGBTQ communities, mostly still doing work with community health and social services. So I like to say helping people be nicer to trans kids. But outside of my professional work, I do organizing, and so I've helped played a little bit of a role. I would say a very small one in the grand scheme of things, advocating for trans rights in Canada. So a few years ago, we passed C-16, which added gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Code. I've also spent a little bit of time getting angry about sex ed and the need for better and more inclusive sex ed. And most recently, advocating for a federal ban on conversion therapy that is truly comprehensive and protects trans people as well. Absolutely.
And I know I've been working in the background a little bit more on some of those things as well. And the sex ed curriculum rollback was a huge thing a few years ago. And I still don't think that we're anywhere close to where we need to be on really educating our youth on and being empowered by their identity in the school system. How do you feel about that?
I 100% agree. I think, our sex ed curriculum is okay. So let's say it's better than it was 10 years ago. It's worse than it was 2 years ago. And it's nowhere near where it should be for 2021. And, it's one thing, I think gender identity, sexual orientation it's referenced and included. Let's be honest about the state of education in Ontario. I don't know if most providers, there are some really great teachers out there and they're teaching great sex ed and they're doing phenomenal work to build inclusive classrooms. But, we still have homophobia and transphobia in our schools, and sex ed is a complicated conversation. And I think one of the biggest things we haven't done is help teachers talk about sex and sexuality and gender in a way that is inclusive. And so I think the curriculum is getting somewhere, but we also need to bring teachers along with us. We need teachers to be able to talk about these concepts because they are the ones that shape the classroom environment in such a fundamental way.
But do you think, and I think for me, when I look at this concept overall of making sure teachers feel empowered to teach this, do you think that part of it is fear-based, fear of the schools that they're teaching in, that they're afraid to talk about these things. They're afraid of the repercussions from parents of maybe non-inclusive households. Do you think that that's an issue that with the curriculum, at least, we could start to offset some of those those issues that teachers face?
Yes, I think there is a ton of fear amongst the teachers who are trying to do good work. When like if we look back to when the provincial government rolled back sex ed, they had a tip line. They had basically like, please report your teachers who dare to talk about LGBTQ identities. Like that wasn't the explicit messaging, but that's how it was perceived, and I think that was intentional. And so we've got teachers who already have to worry about what is actually happening in far right folks targeting inclusive teachers. And we've seen that across the country. Like if you look at the sex ed fight in BC and in Alberta, we are seeing teachers being brought into this, and those teachers are being attacked despite, like, they are the champions in these contexts. They're championing LGBT inclusion. And so I think we need to better equip teachers. We also need to, not tolerate, and actually bluntly, I think as a government, as a province, as a country, say, I don't care if you disagree with what we're teaching your kid. Your kid has a right to this information and has a right to an inclusive classroom.
Yeah, because so many of our laws, I think, kind of work against each other, right? When we look at our current child welfare system, and these youth actually have a right to this information legally, or it could be considered
sex ed is
neglect.
not just like thing that's off the side of the desk. Like Canada has been like called out by the United Nations for the terrible state of our sex ed. Like we are routinely cited. A bunch of United Nations experts wrote to the provincial government saying, Ford, this sex ed thing you're doing, this is bad. You can't do this. Like, we know that this is a right. We just have to put that right into practice. And just like, C-16, the bill that added trans rights to federal human rights legislation, is great. Doesn't actually stop me from getting discriminated against.
Not at all.
It just means that if you beat me up and I happen to grab a photo of you and I'm able to report it to the police, and the police don't be mean to me and aren't transphobic, and they decide to take this seriously, maybe, just maybe that person will be charged, and maybe, just maybe, they will get a slightly worse penalty because it was a hate crime. And that's it. And so rights are one thing as legislation, but how do we actually bring those rights into practice so that we live and breathe them every day, and trans people aren't discriminated against every day?
Right, because I used to say that all the time. It's all right it's great, wonderful to have it on paper, but if we don't practice it in our daily lives, if we don't hold people accountable to transphobia, and another slice of that, I believe, is we need to stop calling it homophobia, because we are murking the waters, and we're making an entire group of our community not exist by calling it something it's not. But if we don't actually practice it, if we don't actually hold people accountable, then all it is words on paper. And I know for one, I'm tired of just having words on paper. How about you?
Like I've been telling this in all of my advocacy whenever I have the chance to speak with any elected official or anybody. So when I will be happy, the point at which I'll be happy is when I actually feel the difference in my communities. When I feel like, when I know that 16-year-old trans kid won't just be forced to crash on somebody's couch, but will have a home, where that like 20-year-old will not have to worry about their safety outside, where that 50-year-old trans woman who just came out won't be fired or forced out of her workplace. Like that, I want to not only, see the symbolism of human rights and equality in legislation, I want to see the people in my community living happy lives and safe lives, and that is my metric of a truly inclusive society.
I 100% agree with you, and I believe that we're so far off from that still, so far off. I think for me personally, and I want to know if you agree with this, I think we kind of force happiness. We learn to accept what is in front of us and try to make the best out of a life that is available to us, and try to actively change things. But I know for me, even just actively trying to change things and always having to be the teacher becomes oppressive in itself. How about for you?
Oh, it's exhausting. Like I almost have there's this invoice I saw at this joke invoice I saw at one point that was basically like a receipt for the emotional labor that you are expected to perform when you're talking to cisgender people about transness. Like, it's I'm doing advocacy. I have to talk about like lived experiences of being harassed and violence, because I hate it, but it gets people to listen and to pay attention. And that is exhausting. Like, it is a particular kind of exhausting when you're spending your everyday just talking to people about tolerating you, about not being bigots. And that's the bar. It's exhausting to have to expect trans people to do that work every single day.
How about having to relive the traumatic experiences when you're doing I know for me it's been hard, but having to constantly relive trauma in order to get cis society to understand that these are the things that are still happening, and that our stories are not the exception, they are the norm.
And that's, I think that I always, like street harassment in particular has been a thing that I'm very curious, interested, and angry about. I routinely, like, as a gender non-conforming, like, I don't look like a cis woman. I don't look like a cis man either. And so, you know, public violence is a constant issue. But I don't think that folks process that, like, I'm not, like, we aren't exaggerating this, and I'm not different than most trans people. I actually probably face less violence than a lot of trans women and transgender people out there, because I'm white, I'm middle class, and I live in a fairly suburban neighborhood. And so I think that folks don't realize, I think that they think that, like, one instance of violence that they heard about trans people facing, I think they think that's it. And I don't think they realize that, like, I can't walk down downtown Ottawa without people looking at me weird. And when you spend all of your time having people look at you weird, and not like in the fun, cool, good way, you start to feel weird in the not fun, good way. You feel weird because you feel like everyone else is staring at you. And that actually has an impact on your mental health, where you feel like an oddity, like you're an abomination almost. Like, that is violent in itself.
100%. I completely agree. You know, and I think I know for me, a lot of people say sometimes I'm passing, sometimes I'm not. If I don't want to wear makeup, I don't wear makeup. And I used to feel empowered by being able to just be. But, you know, when you're in the public eye, as much as say you or I are, there comes along with it a responsibility to make it look like your life is kind of together, like, in order to be validated and to be able to have a platform to speak. And I want to ask you, do you find this as well, that you have to not have problems? And if you have problems and they become public, and my problems are public, like, unfortunately they are at this point, but when you have problems and they become public, you're almost invalidated and told you can no longer do that work. And I faced some of that in this last year. Have you faced that throughout your career of advocacy?
Yeah, people want you to be perfect. Like, you have to be the perfect trans person. And nobody is the perfect trans person, right? Like, that doesn't
What does that even look like?
Right? Like, who is the perfect cis person? Like, I haven't met one yet. Cis folks have lots of problems. But, you know, I think there is this idea that trans people have to be very polite, very respectable. We have to be on our best behavior, or cis people will not take us seriously. And that, there's layers to why that's problematic. But that's expecting, in a world that is violent to us, but we are now being expected to be really polite to people who are actively causing harm and actively hurting us. That is a misnomer. That doesn't add up. But it is a struggle. Like, I work in this space, and the fact that I am perceived as respectable is a thing that helps me pay my bills, is a thing that helps keep me safe in public too, right? Like, the ability, if I look like a respectable cis woman downtown, I am safer because of it. And so it gets so messy because, you know, around my makeup, like, I love wearing makeup. I see my makeup as empowering, and it's a way that I express my gender. But I also wear my makeup because of safety. Because if I don't wear makeup and I go out wearing a really nice dress, the ways in which people will interact with me will be very, very different, because they will go back to a trope of a man in the dress. And so it's the ways, like, I think it's so scary and exhausting that trans people have to navigate always thinking about how other people will react to us just living our lives.
Absolutely. And safety is the key for all of us. I know for me, especially, I'm concerned with my safety all the time, right? I've survived some sexual assaults over the last couple of years, and my life was almost taken this past year, and which I don't talk too much about, but it actually made me withdraw into myself. And then we see other issues start to arise, and I'm a recovering addict, and we have a 76% addictions rate amongst trans-identified people. And it's because what else is there out there for us to use as a coping mechanism when we have therapists that are more concerned about whether we've had our surgery or not, or how trans we are, or what our birth name was. You know, we need to start to normalize trans people getting help, not only in society where we have created, like, I created an organization that provides support, but in cis society, because our problems are not that different than other marginalized populations, let's be honest, right? And somehow we're supporting all those populations. Why can we not support trans-identified people? Do you believe that we are far behind in the times for our movement of rights than we are in, say, the other rainbow spectrum areas?
I think it's interesting. So I agree, but I also have a hard time with the So I think we live in our community spaces. I think we've acknowledged and had conversations around the ways in which we all encounter different degrees of privilege, right? Like the fact that I'm a white trans person is a privilege, despite the fact that I am nonetheless impacted by transphobia. And so I think we have the same thing in our broader communities. I think trans folks are often left out of even our own LGBTQ spaces. And I think that is a huge issue. But I also think, gay men, for example, still have issues of isolation and substance use. And so to me, it's not as much about saying, I think we can acknowledge that progress has moved forward on sexual orientation-based issues, whereas it has lagged behind especially when it comes to public opinion and conception of our communities. We've really lagged behind, and we're seeing right now the same kinds of fights we were having in the 70s and 80s around gay folks. Right? When we're talking about trans rights, we're almost we are seeing the exact same, they're a risk to children or a risk to safety, or they're violent, they're predators. That same kind of drivel that we heard in the anti-homophobia and in the anti-gay movements is very much echoed right now today. And I think that's really interesting. And I think we've come a long way. I think I don't think folks realize how much farther we have to come.
100%. As a divorced 42-year-old white trans woman, I don't even feel safe to date. I really don't, because you're made out to look like a predator if you I'm afraid all the way around, right? And many of us are, and also because of the violence we face when we do that. I always tell trans identified women, just be very careful with online dating and all those things. It's a scary, scary, scary world. And
this is why I don't date people who aren't trans. But within that,
right.
it is a thing, right? I think folks often, it's a testament to how bad it is for trans folks that again, I come from a lot of privilege. Most of my life has been fairly decent. I will put that on the table. I came out as gay at 15. I came out as trans at 20. My life has had some.
How old are you now, Miss?
25. So I got 5 years on me. But the fact that of all people, that I have to worry about my safety when I'm out in public with all of the privileges that I bear, I think says a lot about just how bad life is for trans folks in this country, and particularly for trans folks who don't look like me, who aren't protected by the fact that they're white, who aren't protected by having a home and other aspects. And I don't think that folks have reconciled the degree and depth of violence that trans people face every single day of their lives.
Let's talk about lateral violence for 2 minutes. I want to hear you talk about it, friend.
I think we also, and on the note of lateral violence, I think even in our own communities and spaces, I don't think we're always as good to each other as we could or should be. And I think that is something that I personally struggle with. I see our communities we all use different language. We have different ways of describing who we are. And I think we're so hurt by the violence that cis people have enacted on us that I think it is very hard for us to trust ourselves or each other to be in this together, because we are so ready to be hurt and we're so used to being hurt. And it's hard to build community when everybody is too busy coping with the trauma of a violent world. And I think I think that lateral violence is complicated. I think the root of it is that it is hard for us to love ourselves and each other when the world itself teaches us to hate ourselves and those in our communities with us.
Well, let's also talk in just the LGBT community as a community of its own. Historically, trans-identified people were always excluded, right? And so, and we see, and no offense, Randy's gonna watch this, and he's a white gay man, and I love the heck out of Randy, but we still see white gay men, cis gay men, taking up space and taking our issues and trying to make them their own currently. And Randy's obviously, he provides platforms for folks like myself and yourself to be able to do this kind of work and would never speak for us. But I see it all the time in the work that I do, right? And I know that you've probably experienced that as an advocate out in Ottawa as well, where you're almost erased, and the more palatable version, which is a white gay man, is speaking on our issues and teaching about trans inclusive healthcare. And I'm like, how does that even compute?
Oh, I mean, the fundamental idea of feminist and anti-oppressive movements is nothing about us without us. And it's so ironic to me that, I know very few trans folks who are employed talking about 2SLGQ communities. I am one of the very few that I know, and I had to like beg and scrap to pull together the work that I have. And I've been very lucky to do that. But I think there's an issue. So I get workshop requests fairly often for like an LGBTQ 101 workshop. Yeah. 90% of the time, people actually want a trans 101 workshop. They're actually looking for 100%, how to be inclusive of trans folks. Yet we see folks who aren't trans going in and doing these workshops. And I worry about the content. I worry about like somebody who's not trans, even trans folks, we're not all educators. Not everyone who's trans is ready to do a trans 101 workshop. Yeah. But I worry about how we're not even in the room for conversations about us that are being had in our name, are being had with trans flags and umbrellas and rainbows tossed around everywhere. But where are we in those conversations?
Yeah, I remember going to a conference in Ottawa put on by an organization that you know already. So in your community. And there was a workshop being held by a cisgender person. I also did a workshop there, so I do have to give some credit. But I just remember having to stand up and argue and say, why is this even happening right now? Why is this even happening? Why aren't the trans identified people that are here hosting this workshop, or why aren't they included in the panel at least? I get that this person has a medical background, but bring a trans person along with you to verify or
trans
validate.
People with medical backgrounds, like we have trans people are everywhere in every sector. Literally, there is no excuse for there to just there is no thing a cis person can do that a trans person can't do, and probably better. But that's a little bit bias coming through.
So I want to hear what you're working on now, right? I know that you're doing the several Wisdom to Action. Let's talk a little bit about Wisdom to Action. I want to talk about Trans Pride last year. I didn't get to go to any of the events because, let's be honest, my life was not in a good spot at that point. But I do want to hear about it because it was an amazing thing, and you did it during a pandemic. You started the first Trans Pride in the community. Come on. So let's talk about what you're doing now, what you've done just recently, and what are some of the things you want to get going in this next little bit. We are in a pandemic. I understand it's hard to get things going, but you know what? I think trans people are just creative, and we're creative, facing barriers and overcoming them. So I'm so excited to hear what you're doing now and what you've been doing.
Yeah. So in terms of it, for the past 2 years now, I've been working with Wisdom to Action. So Wisdom to Action is a progressive consulting firm and social enterprise, largely working on community engagement, 2SLGQ inclusion, and knowledge mobilization. The organizations need to not only do longer workshops, but they also have to think more about the organization as a whole, think about policies and procedures, to think about the different contexts. Helping trans people in housing is very different than mental health programs versus primary physical health care. And so we need different skill sets in different aspects of our services. And so our Raising the Bar of resources were intended to help organizations start to think that through and think through what an organizational approach to inclusion might look like. Now, in terms of the thing that I'm most excited about coming up, we are working, so a lot of the evidence says that, trans folks have been impacted by COVID in some unpleasant ways. We know that before COVID, 48% of trans folks in Canada made under $30,000 a year.
Yeah.
We know that during COVID, I believe more than 2/3 of trans folks have had a hard time meeting basic financial obligations or paying their bills. And we also know that of the trans people who have gone to testing or COVID-related services, more than 10% have experienced discrimination in those moments. And so our team, and we'll soon be launching, and I don't have a firm date yet, but in the next month or so, we will be launching in partnership with the Canadian Public Health Association, so the Association of Public Health Organizations, to launch resources on a trans-inclusive COVID-19 response. To help service providers in the front line of vaccination and testing be as inclusive as they can be with practical resources like how to ask pronouns, how to create an inclusive intake form.
I feel like the work that we both have done is so similar. When I was doing this work for the organization that I had founded, it was really, you didn't just get to do a one and done, right? It was a series of trainings, and each training was specialized for whatever organization that I was teaching for the issues that organization was providing supports for. And then you had to sign on to policies and procedures and practices in order to really exact change in that organization. And so I'm grateful to hear that you guys are doing this on such a large scale, and working with public health is just so amazing. So Fae, I just have one last question before we go. Let's talk about how to be an ally, how to support trans identified people. And I want you to go a little deeper too, because I know as a binary person, I need to be a better ally to non-binary individuals and do a better job of understanding. So how can we do that?
I think one of the first ways and places to start is to think about our own genders. Like, I think when we talk about trans inclusion, we so often like think and talk about like those trans people over there, like the ones that aren't in the room or in our communities. And I think one of the best ways to start thinking and learning about trans people is to ask yourself how gender has messed with your life. Like, how, as like, if you're a cis woman, how has gender screwed you over? If you're a cis man, how has patriarchy taught you that you shouldn't be allowed to express your emotions? Like, let's actually start with a very, very basic reflection on our own genders and how those genders have shaped the world we live in. I think that is a first thing we miss. Beyond that, in terms of being an ally to trans folks, I think it depends on your community. I think the needs of trans people in downtown Ottawa are going to be very different from the needs of trans folks in Kentville or Alberta or
Windsor.
Don't get me started on Windsor. Don't get me started on Alberta. They're doing their own things. But you know, like, what are the local needs? What do trans people in an urban context will face things that are very, very different from rural trans folks. So the first step, individually and organizationally, in my book, should be connect with local trans folks. There are trans folks doing the work in your community. I guarantee it. Chat with them. See if you can donate to organizations that work with and support trans folks. And then bring trans folks into your life and think about the needs of the trans folks around you. Think about if you're at an event and you have your trans friend with you, can they get home safe after? Do they have an Uber ride or a cab, or are they within walking distance? Like, let's stop making trans inclusion this like abstract theoretical thing where we all believe that trans people are people, because like we've done that. We should now say that trans people are people. Let's start thinking about the things that we can do in our own lives that are sometimes the small things, but the things that actually can make a difference in the life of a trans person in that moment.
It does look like we are kind of running out of time. I want to thank you for coming and joining me for today's episode of Let's Be Perfectly Queer. Let's not lose contact at all, because I just fangirl over you, and I'm so grateful to have met you today. Keep doing the work you're doing, everybody. Let's thank Fae Johnstone for joining us today. They are a one to watch. So thanks for joining me.
And thank you so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
All right, take care.